action. So you're going to make a loud clap. All right, guys, so we'll go over some structures here in the brain. All this up here, like the superior-most part of the brain, that's called the cerebrum. So all of this is the cerebrum, okay? That's like the forebrain. Now, down here is the cerebellum. It's also called the hindbrain. The cerebellum is this smaller portion of the brain that's involved like in motor behavior. So if you're moving your body, you'll be using your cerebellum in some way. So here's the cerebrum. That's the cerebellum. Now if you look at the cerebrum, you can see there's lots of folds on there. Okay? Now those folds have two different words in terms of the way they're identified. We have gyri and sulci. The gyri are like the hills on here. So, like for instance, this would be a gyrus right there. That's one gyrus, like the hill on this brain. That's a gyrus. And then the valleys between the gyri are the sulci. So that would be the sulcus. Okay, so gyri, sulcus. It's like hills and valleys. The hills are the gyri, the valleys are the sulci. Okay? Now, the cerebrum, all of this, is separated into lobes. Now these lobes are named for the bones that they're nearby. So what do you guys think this is called? Frontal. In fact, it's the frontal lobe. So you have two frontal lobes, one on each side. So frontal lobes. Okay? How about this one back here? Occipital. So you're asking where occipital bone would be. So occipital lobes, the posterior part of the brain. Okay? Now, between the frontal lobe and occipital lobe, we'll have the parietal lobe. So that's the parietal lobe. Okay? Right there in between. And then inferior to all of those, right here, that's the temporal lobe. Makes sense? That's right where the temporal lobe would be. So temporal lobe. So frontal lobe, temporal lobe, occipital lobe, parietal lobe. Now those lobes are separated by specific sulci. We talked about how sulci are like the valleys. And so the sulcus that would separate the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe is this one here. In fact, it's on both sides. This is called the central sulcus. So the central sulcus here separates the frontal lobes from the parietal lobes. Central sulcus. Okay, now this is important to identify anatomically because what's nearby is very important. So this gyrus here that's anterior to the central sulcus, so remember this is the central sulcus there, this gyrus here, just anterior to the central sulcus, that's called the primary motor cortex. So if you're using a skeletal muscle, that behavior or movement is going to originate from this primary motor cortex. Like let's say if somebody gets a stroke and they get paralysis in a part of their body, that's going to affect this primary motor cortex, okay? Which is also called the precentral gyrus. So the precentral gyrus here is the gyrus that's anterior to the central sulcus. Okay. Now, posterior to the central sulcus, this is called the post-central gyrus. So precentral gyrus, post-central gyrus. And the post-central gyrus is your primary somatosensory cortex, and that's involved with basically sensation of like touch and that kind of stuff. So if you can feel a certain body part, you're going to have a conscious perception of that here in the primary somatosensory cortex, which is also called the post-central gyrus. But remember though, the central sulcus is what separates the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. So that means that the precentral gyrus is technically part of the frontal lobe, and the post-central gyrus is technically part of the parietal lobe. Okay? Because they're pre and post to the central sulcus, which separates those lobes. Okay? Now, over here, we talked about how this is the temporal lobe, and the temporal lobe is separate from the frontal and parietal lobes by this sulcus here called the lateral sulcus. So the lateral sulcus is what separates the frontal and parietal lobes from the temporal lobe. That's the lateral sulcus. Okay. Now there's another lobe we can't see very well in this model. Just know that it exists sort of conceptually. If you could separate this lateral sulcus, like kind of pull it apart, deep in there, deep in the lateral sulcus, there would be another lobe called the insula. And the insula has like your gustatory cortex for taste. Okay? You can't see in the model, so you don't worry about identifying it. Just know that it exists conceptually. Okay? Now the parietal lobe is separate from the occipital lobe by what's called the parieto-occipital sulcus. Okay? And that's this one right here. The parieto-occipital sulcus separates the parietal lobe from the occipital lobe. The parieto-occipital sulcus. That one's nice. Like, it sounds like a long word, but it tells you exactly what it does. It separates the parietal and occipital lobes. The parieto-occipital sulcus. Okay. Now, these next two aren't on your list, but it's going to help me teach the rest of the material for me to tell you what these next two are. You don't have to memorize these. Don't write them down if you don't want to memorize them. But it's going to help you understand this next set of material. Okay? So, if you guys didn't know, though, you can actually separate the two halves of your brain. Now, they don't just come apart like that. But there are separate hemispheres to your cerebrum. So you can have a right and left cerebral hemisphere. You guys may have heard this before, like how people talk about how they're like right-brained or left-brained. That's kind of been debunked in recent times. There are some functions that are found mostly on the right cerebrum and some functions that are found mostly on the left cerebrum. But it's not as though somebody only uses their right or only uses their left. You know what I mean? So what happens is the way that your right and left cerebral hemispheres are separated is by something called the longitudinal fissure. That's this space here, the longitudinal fissure. Okay? Now, you might think it should be called like the sagittal fissure or something, because it's right in the sagittal line, and it probably should. For whatever reason, it's called the longitudinal fissure, and it drives me nuts. Like, it just makes sense. Why don't you just call it the sagittal fissure? Like, that would make way more sense. I have no idea why it's a longitudinal fissure. I'm sure whoever named it, that made sense to them, but to me, it's like, yeah. So, in fact, a fissure is like a really deep sulcus. So remember, sulci were the valleys here in the cerebrum. Fissures are really, really deep valleys. Okay, that's why it's a longitudinal fissure, because it's really deep there. Okay. Now, on the posterior part of the brain, separating the cerebellum from the cerebrum, we have the transverse fissure. This one makes sense because it's on the transverse plane. So the transverse fissure here separates the cerebrum from the cerebellum. Transverse fissure. Okay? So, one thing we can't see on this model, and we'll go over in lecture in some more detail, are what are called the meninges. You guys may have heard these before, but the meninges are tissues that surround your brain, and they help support your brain. So if you ever heard of like meningitis, that would be inflammation of the meninges. Okay? Now normally the meninges just sort of surround the outside of your brain. Sometimes they can dive down deep into those fissures I was telling you guys about. So sometimes you can have meninges that actually will dive down deep into the longitudinal fissure. And so for the name of the meninges that goes deep into the longitudinal fissure, that's called falx cerebri. F-A-L-X C-E-R-E-B-R-I. Falx cerebri. You guys ever like touch your pockets and just make sure you have everything there? I had this moment of panic, like, I got wallet, keys, oh no, where's my phone? And she's holding it. I had that brief moment of panic, like, oh no, where's my phone? Okay, so the falx cerebri goes into the longitudinal fissure. And this fissure over here is a transverse fissure. Now the tissues of the meninges that go deep into the transverse fissure, that's called tentorium cerebelli, right? Because here's the cerebellum. Tentorium cerebelli would be like where my hand is. And it almost forms like a tent over the cerebellum. That's how you can think about it. Tentorium cerebelli. Kind of forms like a tent over the cerebellum. So tentorium cerebelli. Okay? It goes deep into the transverse fissure. Now there's another tissue here called falx cerebelli. In falx cerebelli, you find between your two cerebellar hemispheres. Before we had falx cerebri between the two cerebral hemispheres. Between the two cerebellar hemispheres, we're going to have falx cerebelli. It's a type of meningeal layer that goes deep between the two cerebellar hemispheres, or halves. So there'd be falx cerebelli in there. Okay? Now, within those tissues, we're going to find spaces. Okay, so that the meninges are made of lots of layers of tissues. Okay? And so within those tissues, sometimes the layers can separate. And when they separate, it'll form a space, and those spaces are called the dural sinuses. Okay, now the dural sinuses are blood-filled spaces within the meninges. Okay? And so what happens then is that the venous blood from your brain actually drains into those spaces, like the dural venous sinuses. It's going to have venous blood. Okay. Now, the name for the dural venous sinus in falx cerebri is called the superior sagittal sinus. Okay. So falx cerebri was it here in the longitudinal fissure, and the name for the blood-filled space within falx cerebri is the superior sagittal sinus. Right here. Superior sagittal sinus. Blood-filled space right in there. Now, there's some great pictures in your textbook that show this. So definitely check that out if you guys are confused by this, because I have to just sort of tell you what should be there instead of showing you, because I don't have a model to show you this, so it makes it a little bit more difficult. Okay. So, what was the name of the meninges that went into the transverse fissure? You guys remember?
Tentorium cerebelli.
Good. Tentorium cerebelli. Now the name of the dural venous sinus in tentorium cerebelli, that's transverse sinus. That one makes it easy. So it'd be transverse sinus in there. It'd be a space within tentorium cerebelli. Okay, now there's another one called straight sinus, and it's just kind of deeper in the brain. Now, and all of those sinuses meet up. So superior sagittal sinus, transverse sinus, and straight sinus, kind of deeper in there, they all meet at one point called the confluence of the sinuses. You know how when rivers meet, they form a confluence? So right there, you'd have the confluence of the sinuses. Okay. And they all meet up together. Now the reason why these are important is that all these sinuses, because they carry venous blood, they're all going to converge into the confluence of the sinuses, and then that forms your jugular veins. And so your jugular veins are going to carry blood, venous blood, down your neck, away from your brain, back to your heart. So all these dural venous sinuses drain into your jugular veins. All right, cool. Now, you might look at the brain here and think it looks like a pretty solid structure. You know, I've asked you guys if this was one big piece of tissue. Just looking from the outside, you might say that. We don't know if there's any space in there. Now, it turns out that there are large spaces within the brain, and these are called the ventricles. Okay, so the ventricles are these large fluid-filled spaces within the brain that help make the brain more buoyant. So we can see one of these here. This large space deep in the brain, that's called the lateral ventricle. So that's the lateral ventricle. And each cerebral hemisphere has a lateral ventricle. Okay? So this would be the lateral ventricle on the right side. There would be a lateral ventricle on the left side too. So lateral ventricle. It's this large fluid-filled space within your brain. In fact, this ventricular system, it makes your brain 97% weightless. So pretty much your brain is it really is just floating within your skull. It decreases the weight of your brain by almost 100%. Because your brain is so soft, it actually would crush under its own weight. Like if you didn't have a ventricular system, it actually would get damaged by its own weight inside the skull. So it has to float. Okay? And so that's going to excuse me, that's going to be the lateral ventricle right there. Okay. Now the lateral ventricles are hooked up to a center ventricle called the third ventricle, and that's this one right here. So you guys see there's like a little indentation right here, or the space? Get a look at it from the side. There's a little like indent right here. That's the third ventricle. Okay, so both lateral ventricles connect to that third ventricle. Now I'll get some water and I'll show you guys how this works. So I'm going to pour some water in here. Okay, so I'm going to put some water in the third ventricle just so you guys can see what that looks like. Some of it drained out, but do you guys see that? It's kind of draining. Right there. That space that the water filled in, that's the third ventricle. Okay. Now the third ventricle is connected to another space down here called the fourth ventricle, and I can fill that one up with water too. Right there. That's the fourth ventricle. In fact, the fourth ventricle is connected to the third ventricle by this little duct here called the cerebral aqueduct. In fact, you guys see how water kind of started draining in here? So the third and fourth ventricles are connected by a cerebral aqueduct. Okay? In fact, all these ventricles are connected together. So the lateral ventricle is connected to the third third ventricle connects to the fourth ventricle. Okay, let me drain this water a little bit. Fine, still step there. It'll be slip. Oh, that was dumb of me. I should have done that. Somebody's going to slip on that.
It's on camera.
There.
It's on camera too, so.
Is it? I know, right? The reason that's in my brain is I've done that before. Like I cleaned up a spill once in a hospital, and it was still kind of wet, and somebody was running, you know, and she slipped. Oh no, yeah, I know. It's a good way to get sued. All right. So that's the ventricular system, you guys. Now I'll show you guys is some deeper brain structures. So we talked about how the superior part of the brain was all the cerebrum. Okay, and we have the cerebellum down here. Now let's use this half. I like this half. So what happens then is that yes.
Sorry, before we move on, could we go over the arachnoid villi?
Oh yeah, good. Thank you.
Did you do the straight sinus?
Yeah, I did. Yeah.
Which one is that?
That one's just deeper in the brain.
Deeper.
Yeah, it's around here,
Okay.
right around there. So the arachnoid villi, we can't see on here, but it's more of a conceptual thing. The arachnoid villi are that's where CSF, or cerebrospinal fluid, is reabsorbed back into your dural venous sinuses. So we talked about how the ventricular system has cerebrospinal fluid within it. That cerebrospinal fluid actually gets reabsorbed back into your bloodstream or your dural venous sinuses by these little structures called arachnoid villi. They kind of look like these little mushrooms, and that's where it gets reabsorbed. Now the tissue that makes cerebrospinal fluid is called choroid plexus. You're going to see that on your list right underneath third ventricle there. So in fact, choroid plexus is found in all the ventricles. And choroid plexus is a type of tissue that makes cerebrospinal fluid. Or cerebrospinal fluid is a lot like Gatorade. It's just like water, electrolytes, and sugar. And it's made by choroid plexus. And you're going to find that in all your ventricles, lateral, third, and fourth. Okay? All right. So one thing I want to show you guys really quick is the diencephalon. So all of this here is the diencephalon. Now the diencephalon is just a brain region, and there's 3 parts to the diencephalon. You'll have a thalamus here, kind of a central region. You'll have the hypothalamus, which is below the thalamus, okay, because hypo means below. And then we'll have an epithalamus back here. So all the diencephalon is made of the thalamus, hypothalamus, epithalamus. Now the thalamus is like a sensory relay portion of your brain. So most of your sensory information goes to your thalamus, and your thalamus kind of sorts and processes that information. The hypothalamus, that's going to be involved in helping to regulate homeostasis. So when we think homeostasis, think hypothalamus. And it's also a brain region here below the thalamus. Okay? And then posterior back here, just posterior to the thalamus, that's the epithalamus. Now the epithalamus includes a gland called the pineal gland, which is 54 on here. That's the pineal gland. And the pineal gland makes a hormone called melatonin, which helps regulate your sleep-wake cycle. Okay? Now the hypothalamus also has a gland associated with it, and that's called the pituitary gland. You guys may have heard this before, but they call it like the master gland because it releases a lot of hormones. Now the pituitary gland, we're going to see actually on this side here. So let me show you guys on this half. So here the thalamus here, epithalamus posteriorly, and this is the hypothalamus just below the thalamus. Okay. Now connected to the hypothalamus, we're going to have this sort of little ball-looking thing here. That's the pituitary gland. And the pituitary gland, it's an endocrine gland, so it releases hormones. And the pituitary gland is connected to your hypothalamus by a little piece of tissue right there called the infundibulum. So the infundibulum is what connects your pituitary gland to the hypothalamus. The infundibulum. Now, if you get a pituitary tumor, like if you get a tumor in your pituitary gland, the pituitary gland can swell, grow bigger, and that can cause visual problems. And the reason being is that your pituitary gland is right by your optic nerves. Okay? So I'm going to put these halves together to show you guys this. Okay? So remember, there's the pituitary gland, that little ball-looking thing. So there's the pituitary gland. And these are the optic nerves, just right by. So two of my fingers there. Each one of those is one optic nerve. So information from your eyes is going to be carried back to your brain through these optic nerves. Well, it turns out the pituitary gland is right there, right by the optic nerves. In fact, the optic nerves come together to form a structure called the optic chiasm. And that's right there, right by the pituitary gland. So in front of my finger, when the optic nerves converge into one, that forms something called the optic chiasm. Optic chiasm, right where the optic nerves converge. Okay? That's optic chiasm. Now, let's skip ahead to the cerebellum, just because I got a nice complete cerebellum to show you guys really quick before I take this apart. So go down to the cerebellum, which should be last on your list there for the brain. Now the cerebellum, you're going to have two cerebellar hemispheres, just like you have two cerebral hemispheres. In the cerebellum, you're going to have what are called folia and sulci. Instead of gyri and sulci, you have folia and sulci. So the folia are like these really thin gyri on the cerebellum. So there's a lot of them. All those little folds, those are the folia. Kind of like a really thin gyri on the cerebellum. And then the sulci are the same thing. It's just the gyri aren't called gyri on the cerebellum, they're called folia. And the reason why they're called folia is it comes from like foliage, meaning leaves, like leaves on a tree. In fact, if we take this brain off, and I'll show you guys in cross-section here. In cross-section, it's hard to see on this model, but there's some white matter in the cerebellum. If you guys remember, white matter is the part that's myelinated. There's some white matter that's actually shaped like a tree. It's called arbor vitae, which means tree of life. So the arbor vitae is like a tree of life here in the cerebellum, and the folia would be like the leaves in the tree of life. Okay? That's a good way to remember it. It doesn't look great on this model. Your book has some nice pictures. Like if you look on here, let's focus on there. So right there, all that white matter branching, that's folia here on the cross section of the cerebellum. So you can see the folia there. I'm sorry, not folia, the arbor vitae, the tree of life. And then the folia would be like the leaves on that tree of life, all those little lines. Okay. All right, guys, a couple more structures. And that's the brainstem. Now the brainstem is basically this between my fingers, and it includes three different parts: a midbrain, pons, and medulla oblongata. Okay. So the midbrain is the superior part of the brainstem. The pons is in the middle. and the medulla oblongata is inferior. Okay? So midbrain, pons, medulla oblongata. Now the midbrain has a couple structures. We'll have what are called the cerebral peduncles and something else called the corpora quadrigemina. So let me show you guys the cerebral peduncle really quick. So if this is the midbrain here, if that's all midbrain, the anterior part of the midbrain, right there, number 67 on the model, that's the cerebral peduncle. And what that is basically going to be a big bundle of nerve fibers that are carrying motor information to your skeletal muscle. So the cerebral peduncles carry motor information down to skeletal muscles. Okay, cerebral peduncle. Now, posterior to the cerebral peduncles, on the very posterior part of the midbrain, we have these two bumps here. The superior bump's called the superior colliculus, and the inferior bump's called the inferior colliculus. Now, those bumps are part of a group called the corpora quadrigemini. Now, the corpora quadrigemina means the body of four twins. Corpora means body, like corpse. Quad means four. Gemini means twin. So corpora quadrigemina means body of four twins. Now what we see here is this is a half of a brain, so we can only see two bumps here. But if you put another half on, you can see there actually would be four bumps side by side. Okay. Now if you guys are interested, superior colliculi are involved in visual reflex. Like if you just avert your eyes, or like, I'm sorry, not avert. Like if you look at something just reflexively, that's going to be involving the superior colliculus. And if you hear something and respond reflexively, that's going to be the inferior colliculus, this auditory reflex. Okay? And so these colliculi are part of the midbrain, just as the cerebral peduncle is. Now the corpora quadrigemini, which includes superior and inferior colliculi, those are separate from the cerebral peduncle by this structure here called the cerebral aqueduct. If you guys remember, the cerebral aqueduct is what connects the third and fourth ventricles together. You can see the cerebral aqueduct there between the midbrain. So third and fourth ventricle connected by the cerebral aqueduct.